In May of 1970, Queen Elizabeth II pinned the Victoria Cross to the chest of a 43-year-old warrant officer who had walked through 4 wars across 26 years. 4 days later, the Australian Army discharged him. 8 years after that, he died of cancer in Tokyo, and almost nobody in Australia noticed. Tell me in the comments whether you have heard of Rayene Simpson before today, because if you haven't, that is the first thing this story needs to address. Rayene Simpson, Ray to everyone who served with him, was born on the 16th of February, 1926, at Redfern in Sydney. Third child of New South Wales, born parents Robert William Simpson, laborer, and his wife Olga Maud, née Montgomery. Olga deserted her husband and children about 1931. Ray was 5 years old. Separated from his siblings, he was placed in the Church of England Home for Boys, Carlingford. The childhood that followed was institutional. Dormitories, shared meals, a bed that belonged to the orphanage, not to him. Educated at Carlingford Public School and later at Dumaresque Island. Public school near Taree, he was sent to work on a dairy farm at 12. The work was hard. The pay was minimal. At 14, he returned to Sydney and found employment as a laborer. No particular prospects, no family to return to. When the Second World War began in 1939, Simpson was 13 and too young to enlist. He waited 5 years. On the 15th of March, 1944, 4 weeks after his 18th birthday, he walked into a recruiting office and signed his name. The Australian Imperial Force assigned him to the 41st 2nd Infantry Battalion, a holding unit for soldiers under 19. Training formation, preparing young men for deployment to the Pacific campaigns. Army life fit without difficulty. The structure was clear. The expectations were explicit. Nobody asked where his family was, because nobody in the ranks had come from anywhere that mattered more than what they could do with a rifle. On the morning of the 5th of August, 1944, Simpson had his first taste of action. Part of a detachment sent to reinforce garrison troops at Cowra after the escape of several hundred Japanese prisoners of war. The Cowra breakout was the largest prison escape of World War II. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, 1,104 Japanese prisoners, armed with improvised weapons, baseball bats, sharpened mess knives, blankets for protection against barbed wire, launched a mass assault on the perimeter fences of Camp B at the No. 12 prisoner of war compound, near Cowra, in the central west of New South Wales. The Australian garrison, composed primarily of the 22nd Garrison Battalion, opened fire. By the time the breakout ended and recapture operations concluded over the following 9 days, 231 Japanese prisoners were dead, most by suicide or in the initial assault. 4 Australian soldiers were killed. One of Simpson's duties that morning was to man No. 1 Vickers machine gun, identical to No. 2 gun, which several hours earlier had been defended to the death by privates Benjamin Gower Hardy and Ralph Jones, both posthumously awarded the George Cross. 18 years old, 5 months in the Army. The 2 soldiers who had held the position before him were dead. The Japanese prisoners who had killed them were dead. Standing behind the gun, waiting for orders, Simpson received his first understanding of what being expendable meant. Subsequent posting to the 2nd 3rd Pioneer Battalion, then an advanced ordnance depot, finally the 26th Australian Infantry Battalion. Service on Morotai, an island in the Dutch East Indies taken by Allied forces in September of 1944. Deployment to Tarakan off the coast of Borneo, where Australian forces conducted amphibious operations in May of 1945. Service at Rabaul in New Guinea, where tens of thousands of Japanese troops remained isolated after the main thrust of the Pacific War had moved north. The fighting Simpson saw was not the kind that generated headlines. mopping up work, occupation duties. Long months waiting for orders that never changed because the war had already moved on. On the 20th of January, 1947, demobilization in Sydney. 20 years old. The army no longer needed him. 4 years of jobs that did not take. Tram conductor in Sydney. Builders. Laborer. Sugarcane cutter in Queensland. Sailor around Papua New Guinea. None of it stuck. The structure that had held him since 18 was gone, and civilian employment offered no equivalent. In January of 1951, he walked back into a recruiting office and signed his name a second time. 5 months after re-enlistment, Korea. Reinforcement for the 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment. The Korean War had been running since June of 1950, when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. United Nations forces, led by the United States, intervened. Australia committed ground troops in September as part of the Commonwealth contribution. The 3rd Battalion arrived in late September and was immediately committed to combat operations. By the time Simpson joined in mid-1951, 3RAR had already distinguished itself at the Battle of Kapyong, where it held defensive positions against repeated Chinese assaults over 2 days and nights in April. The action earned a United States Presidential Unit citation for extraordinary heroism. Service with 3RAR through the static phase of the war, when front lines stabilized along the 38th parallel and combat devolved into patrol actions, trench raids, and artillery duels across a no-man's land that shifted by meters. The conditions were brutal. Winter temperatures dropped well below zero. Summer brought monsoon rains that flooded trenches and turned earth into a sucking bog. Promoted to Lance Corporal on the 30th of November, 1951. Promoted again to Corporal on the 21st of January, 1953. During a rest period in Japan, Simpson met Sakai Shoko, a divorcee. The meeting occurred sometime in late 1952 or early 1953. The sources conflict on the precise timeline, which is itself revealing. What is not in dispute is marriage on the 5th of March, 1952, at Cowra, Japan. Other accounts place the ceremony on the 16th of January, 1953, at the same location. The record holds both accounts. It does not resolve them. What matters is that the courtship, by any measure, was brief. Less than 1 month before marriage. She did not speak fluent English. He did not speak Japanese. The union was not conventional by any standard that applied to people outside it. Posted to the 2nd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, in January of 1954. Shoko remained in Japan, promoted to temporary sergeant in February, rank confirmed on the 1st of July, 1955. What held the marriage together across that distance would not become clear until Vietnam. Malaya was the third conflict. The Malayan emergency had been running since 1948, when communist insurgents, primarily ethnic Chinese operating from jungle bases, began a campaign of sabotage and assassination aimed at destabilizing British colonial control. Australian forces deployed in 1950 as part of the Commonwealth response. The 2nd Battalion rotated into Malaya in October of 1955, 2 years conducting operations against communist guerrilla forces in the dense jungle terrain of the Malay Peninsula. The insurgency was a different kind of war from Korea. No front lines, no trenches. The enemy was invisible until contact occurred, and contact meant a burst of automatic fire from cover, casualties in the first seconds, and insurgents melting back into the jungle before effective response could be organized. Posted to the 1st Special Air Service Company in November of 1957. The unit was based near Perth in Western Australia. The SAS was the Australian Army's elite special operations force, and selection indicated Simpson had proven himself capable of functioning under conditions that broke lesser men. Nearly 5 years with one SAS company, including a tour as an instructor. In July of 1962, promotion to Warrant Officer Class 2 and selection as one of the initial 30 members of the Australian Army Training Team, Vietnam. The Australian Army Training Team Vietnam was the first Australian unit deployed to South Vietnam. Arrival in Saigon in July and August of 1962, following a request from the Republic of Vietnam for military assistance in training South Vietnamese forces. The team's initial role was strictly advisory. 30 officers, warrant officers, and sergeants, all volunteers, all experienced soldiers, assigned to work alongside South Vietnamese units to improve tactics, weapons handling, and small unit operations. The advisors lived with Vietnamese units, accompanied them on operations, but were not authorized to engage in direct combat. That restriction would not last. In June of 1964, the Australian government announced that AATTV members could serve in combatant roles. By that point, Simpson had already completed his first 12-month tour and returned to Australia in July of 1963, posting back to 1st SAS Company as an instructor at the Officer Cadet School in Portsea, Victoria. The assignment lasted 1 year. In July of 1964, departure for Saigon a second time. The second tour took him to Da Nang, where he was attached to A Team with United States and South Vietnamese Special Forces. Posting to Cam Duc in Quang Nam Province, a remote outpost accessible only by Caribou aircraft, operating from a small airstrip carved into the mountainous terrain near the Laos border. Instrumental in establishing a new patrol base at Ta Co, a rugged village positioned to control cross-border infiltration by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces moving along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The base was manned by a civil irregular defense group composed of Vietnamese soldiers and Montagnard tribesmen, ethnic minorities from the Central Highlands, recruited and trained by U.S. Special Forces to conduct operations in areas where the Army of the Republic of Vietnam had little presence. The advisors at Ta Co, Australian, American, and South Vietnamese, led daily patrols designed to push gradually outward, expanding the area under nominal government control and interdicting enemy movement. On the 16th of September, 1964, patrol with a platoon-sized Vietnamese Special Forces unit when ambushed by soldiers of the People's Liberation Armed Forces, the Viet Cong. The Vietnamese officer leading the patrol was killed in the opening burst. Simpson was severely wounded by rifle fire in the right leg. The patrol was pinned down. The Viet Cong force was superior in numbers and had the advantage of prepared positions. Despite the wound, rallied the remaining soldiers, formed a defensive perimeter, and contacted the base by radio, called for assistance, and held off repeated Viet Cong assaults while waiting for relief. The fighting continued for hours. Ammunition ran low, weak from blood loss. When the relief force finally arrived, the patrol had almost nothing left to fight with. Evacuation by helicopter to the 6th Field Hospital at Nha Trang. Transfer to a military hospital in Tokyo for convalescence. Shoko was there, the first time they had been in the same city since deployment 6 months earlier, for the action at Ta Co, award of the Distinguished Conduct Medal, the second highest decoration for gallantry available to Commonwealth forces. The citation noted personal example, leadership under fire, and the fact that his actions had saved the lives of soldiers under his command. Returned to Australia in June of 1965, posting to the 1st Battalion, Royal New South Wales Regiment, the commando unit based in Sydney, in January of 1966. In May of that year, at his own request, discharged from the Australian Army for the second time in his life. The discharge lasted 13 months. What happened in those 13 months is not detailed in any public record. What is documented is that in May of 1967, Rayene Simpson paid his own way to Saigon and re-enlisted, reappointed to the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam for a third tour of duty. The explanation for the third tour, given in an interview published in 1969, was direct. "I keep extending service because of my Japanese wife, Shoko. She has to stay in Japan at the moment because her mother has a bad heart. So being up here in Vietnam, I get extension leave every time I decide to stay on. That way I can see her for 30 days. The logic was precise. Service in Vietnam entitled advisors to periodic leave. Leave could be taken in Japan. If he stayed in Vietnam, he could see Shoko every few months for 30 days at a time. If he returned to Australia and took up a posting there, he would see her almost never. The army that had taken him at 18, that had given him structure when civilian life offered none, now offered him the only mechanism by which he could maintain a marriage to a woman who could not leave Japan and whom he would not abandon. The mathematics were unconventional. They worked. By May of 1969, continuous operations with indigenous forces in the Central Highlands for 2 years. The Australian Army Training Team Vietnam had grown from its original 30 advisors to a peak strength of approximately 200 men in South Vietnam at any one time. Over the course of the war, nearly 1,000 Australians would serve with the AATTV, along with a small number of New Zealanders. The team was the first Australian unit into Vietnam and would be the last to leave when the Australian commitment ended in 1972. One of the most highly decorated units in the history of the Australian Army. Over the course of the war, AATTV members received more than 100 military decorations. 4 of those decorations were the Victoria Cross. They were the only 4 Victoria Crosses awarded to Australians during the Vietnam War. All 4 went to members of the same small advisory unit. The first was awarded to Warrant Officer Kevin Arthur Wheatley, known as Dasher, killed in action on the 13th of November, 1965, during a patrol in the Tra Bong Valley in Quang Ngai Province. The second was awarded posthumously to Major Peter John Badco, killed on the 7th of April, 1967, while leading South Vietnamese troops during an assault on fortified Viet Cong positions near the hamlet of An Thuan in Thua Tien Province. The third was awarded to Warrant Officer Keith Payne on the 24th of May, 1969, for actions during a battle in which his battalion was overrun by North Vietnamese forces, and Payne organized the evacuation of wounded soldiers under sustained enemy fire. The fourth would be awarded to Rayene Stewart Simpson for actions on the 6th and 11th of May, 1969, in Kon Tum Province, near the border with Laos, serving as commander of the 292nd Mobile Strike Force Company, part of the 5th Special Forces Group. The Mobile Strike Force, known as Mike Force, was composed primarily of Montagnard soldiers led by American and Australian advisors. The Montagnards were hill tribes from the Central Highlands, ethnically and culturally distinct from the lowland Vietnamese, recruited by U.S. Special Forces to conduct operations in the remote border regions where government control was minimal and enemy infiltration was constant. Working with these forces for more than a year. 43 years old. The jungle near Kon Tum Province, where the borders of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia met, was about to produce the 2 actions that would earn him a decoration his country had awarded 96 times since its establishment in 1856. On the 6th of May, 1969, the 232nd Mobile Strike Force Company was conducting a battalion-scale search and clear operation in Kon Tum Province, near the Laotian border, in the 2nd Corps Tactical Zone, near the junction of 3 national borders. The terrain was jungle, large trees, with dense bamboo undergrowth. Weather was rain. Visibility was poor. The company was moving through the jungle when one of Simpson's platoons became heavily engaged with enemy forces. Leading the remainder of his company forward to assist, disregarding the dangers involved, he placed himself at the front of his troops, thus becoming a focal point for enemy fire and personally led the assault on the left flank of the enemy position. As the company moved forward, one of the platoon commanders, Australian Warrant Officer Michael William Thomas Gill, was seriously wounded. The assault began to falter. The Indigenous soldiers, seeing their Australian advisor hit, started to pull back. At great personal risk and under heavy enemy fire, movement across open ground. Reaching Gill, carrying him to a position of safety. Returned to the company, with complete disregard for his own safety, crawling forward to within 10 meters of the enemy position and throwing grenades into their fortifications. Darkness was falling. The enemy position held. Recognition that the assault had failed. Ordering the company to withdraw. Throwing smoke grenades to cover the movement. Carrying the wounded platoon leader, accompanied by 5 Indigenous soldiers, covering the withdrawal of the company. The company withdrew, carrying its wounded. The enemy position held. The action was tactually indecisive. What it demonstrated was something the citation writers would later struggle to capture in the formal language required by the award. Placing himself between his soldiers and the force trying to kill them, staying there until every man who could be moved had been moved. The citation would later use measured phrasing to describe this. The tactical reality was simpler. His body became the barrier. The bullets meant for others hit the ground around him or passed overhead because he was the target drawing fire. That was the function chosen. Human shield is not a role the Army trains soldiers to perform. It is a decision about what your body is worth, measured against the bodies of the men you lead. Next morning, the company rejoined the battalion in another position where it was resupplied. 3 days later, on the 10th of May, contact was again made with the enemy. But insufficient air support and the reluctance of the Indigenous soldiers to press the attack caused the engagement to be broken off. At first light on the 11th of May, artillery pounded the suspected enemy positions, and the battalion moved forward again to find the bunkers unoccupied. The battalion probed ahead. Warrant Officer A.M. Kelly was leading the 231st Company. In the first burst of fire from the next contact, Kelly was wounded. Captain Green of the American Special Forces, the battalion commander, was killed when he went forward to assist Kelly. An Australian warrant officer was wounded. Several Indigenous soldiers were hit. One other Australian warrant officer had been separated from the majority of his troops and was contained in the area by enemy fire, quickly organizing 2 platoons of Indigenous soldiers and several advisors, leading them to the position of contact. On reaching the position, the element with Simpson came under heavy fire. All but a few of the soldiers with him fell back. The unit disintegrated, disregarding his own safety, moving forward in the face of accurate enemy machine gun fire in order to cover the initial evacuation of the casualties. The wounded were eventually moved out of the line of enemy fire, which all this time was directed at Warrant Officer Simpson from close range. At the risk of almost certain death, several attempts to move further forward toward Captain Green's body. On each occasion stopped by heavy fire. The battalion commander could not be reached, recognizing that the position was becoming untenable and that priority should be given to extracting other casualties as quickly as possible, alone and still under enemy fire, covering the withdrawal of the wounded by personally placing himself between the wounded and the enemy. The geometry was exact. Simpson stood. The wounded lay behind him. The enemy fired from ahead. The bullets traveled the space between those 3 points, and Simpson occupied the intersection. Fighting from that position, not because it was tactically advantageous, it was tactically suicidal, but because it was the only position from which his body could block the line of fire. Staying there until the wounded were moved beyond the range where his placement mattered. From this position, fighting on, and by outstanding courage and valor, preventing the enemy advance until the wounded were removed from the immediate vicinity. The wounded were successfully evacuated to the helicopter pad. Captain Green's body was left in the jungle. The action ended indecisively the next day when the battalion was evacuated. Captain Green's body remained in the jungle near Kontum province. Attempts to reach it under fire that would have killed him, recognition of the tactical impossibility, and a shift to what could be accomplished. The wounded were extracted. The living went home. That was the accounting. On the 21st of August, 1969, the Prime Minister of Australia, John Gorton, released a statement. Her Majesty the Queen had awarded the Victoria Cross to a member of the Australian Army Training Team, Vietnam, Warrant Officer Class 2, Rayene Simpson, Distinguished Conduct Medal. The statement noted that Simpson had displayed outstanding heroism on 2 separate occasions during an operation with a mobile strike force in Kontum province in May of that year. Still serving in Vietnam when the announcement was made. The citation concluded with the assessment that Warrant Officer Simpson's repeated acts of personal bravery in the operation were an inspiration to all Vietnamese, United States, and Australian soldiers who served with him, and that his conspicuous gallantry was in the highest tradition of the Australian Army. The 4th Victoria Cross, awarded to members of the Australian Army Training Team, Vietnam. Kevin Wheatley and Peter Badco had received the decoration posthumously. Keith Payne had received his award 3 weeks before Simpson's was announced. Payne survived the war, 3rd living Australian to receive the Victoria Cross for actions in Vietnam. In addition to the Victoria Cross and the Distinguished Conduct Medal, award also of the United States Silver Star and the Bronze Star for actions during the 3 tours. Longer service with the AATTV than any other soldier. By the time the Victoria Cross was announced, more than 5 years in Vietnam across 3 tours. 43 years old. On the 1st of May, 1970, presentation of the Victoria Cross by Queen Elizabeth II at Government House in Sydney. Shoko attended the ceremony. The photograph from the investiture shows Simpson in dress uniform, the ribbon of the Victoria Cross bright against his chest, standing beside his wife. She is smiling. He is not. On the 4th of May, 1970, 3 days after receiving the highest award for valor his country could bestow, discharged from the Australian Army. 44 years old. Released with a medal, a pension, and no clear idea of what a man like him was supposed to do in a country where nobody was shooting at him. In 1972, Simpson and Shoko were living in Tokyo. Immediately after discharge in 1970, employment with a liquor importing firm in Tokyo. In September of 1970, a letter to Warrant Officer Class 2 Danny Neville, who had also served with the AATTV and had been awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal. The letter, 6 pages long, reflected nostalgia for the mates he had served with in Vietnam, ongoing interest in the course of the war, and pessimism regarding current military strategy. Reflections on U.S. policy, the capabilities of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, and the likelihood of a communist victory. The letter is one of the few extended pieces of Simpson's own voice that exists in the public record. In 1972, departure from the liquor importing business and acceptance of an administrative position with the Australian Embassy in Tokyo. 6 years in that role. Shoko remained with him, her mother, whose ill health had been the reason Shoko could not leave Japan, eventually passed away. But by that point, a life had been built in Tokyo, and there was no reason to return to Australia. On the 18th of October, 1978, Rayene Simpson died of cancer at the University of Tokyo Medical Clinic, 52 years old. Cremated. Buried at the Yokohama Commonwealth War Cemetery in Japan. His body never returned to Australia. Survived by his wife, Shoko. The Australian War Memorial in Canberra holds his medals and his portrait, painted by Joshua Smith in 1971. What Simpson did in those 8 years between receiving the Victoria Cross and dying of cancer at 52, belongs to the part of the record that does not want to discuss itself. The administrative officer position at the embassy. Daily life with Shoko in Tokyo. Whether he followed the final collapse of South Vietnam in April of 1975, when North Vietnamese forces overran Saigon and the war he had fought in ended in complete defeat for the side he had supported. Whether he regretted anything. Whether the wounds from Ta Co still troubled him. The record is silent on all of it. In 1981, 3 years after his death, his medals came into the Australian War Memorials collection. In July of 1996, Carlingford Public School, where Simpson had been a student before the Army took him, installed a memorial in its foyer. Representatives of the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam and the Vietnam Veterans Association of Australia presented it. The memorial includes a photograph of Simpson, reproductions of his awards, and the text of his Victoria Cross citation. As far as the public record indicates, it is the only memorial to Simpson that exists anywhere in Australia. The Australian Army Training Team Vietnam was the first Australian unit deployed to South Vietnam, arriving in July and August of 1962. The last Australian unit to leave, withdrawing in December of 1972 after more than 10 years of continuous operations. Nearly 1,000 Australians served over the course of the war. 4 Victoria Crosses. All of Australia's Vietnam War. Victoria Crosses went to members of this single advisory unit. Yet the unit remains relatively unknown outside military history circles and veteran associations. No major films, no widely circulated books, no prominent public monuments. The small unit advisory mission, operating in remote areas with indigenous forces attached to American Special Forces, does not generate the same cultural weight as battalion-level operations involving thousands of Australian soldiers fighting conventional engagements. In 2017, 45 years after the AATTV left Vietnam, the Australian government formally recognized the unique contribution the team had made to the war. The Minister for Veterans Affairs, Dan Tehan, noted that the AATTV had served in Vietnam for over 10 years and had been one of the most highly decorated units in Australian military history. The recognition came. It came late. Simpson had been dead for 39 years by the time the government issued the statement. National memories are not always rational about which stories they carry forward. The small unit operating beyond the wire does not generate the same narrative weight as the battalion holding a position against a massed assault. That it happened here, with Simpson and the AATTV, is documented. It is simply what occurred. Simpson himself left little extended public record of how he understood his service. The 1969 interview, in which he explained his reasons for extending in Vietnam to get leave to see Shoko, is one of the few instances where his own voice appears. The September 1970 letter to Danny Neville is another. In that letter, expression of nostalgia for the men he had served with, concern about how the war was being prosecuted, and a clear-eyed assessment that the outcome was likely to be a communist victory. What was not expressed in that letter or anywhere else in the available record was any claim to heroism, any political justification for his service, or any attempt to frame what he had done in the language of valor that others would later use to describe it. Those who knew Simpson described him as fearless, as a man who did not always follow the rules, as someone who knew every swear word in the book. They also described him as possessing inspirational leadership, steadfast loyalty to his mates, and devotion to his wife. No memoir, no extended interviews, receipt of his Victoria Cross, discharge from the Army 3 days later, and disappearance into an administrative job at an embassy in a foreign country. The silence itself is data. The man who had crawled forward to within 10 meters of an enemy position throwing grenades did not, in the 8 years between his Victoria Cross and his death, give any public account of why he had done it. The question of whether he thought his service worthwhile, whether he carried the weight of decisions made under fire, whether he regretted the mathematics that had kept him deploying to a war so he could spend 30 days at a time with the woman he loved, remains unanswered. What he said was that he kept extending because it meant he could see his wife. What he did not say was everything else. In August of 1944, an 18-year-old orphan who had been abandoned by his mother at 5 and raised in an institution stood behind a machine gun at Cowra after 2 soldiers had been killed defending the same position hours earlier. Survival. Service in the Pacific. Demobilization in January of 1947, and 4 years trying to make civilian life work. It did not. Re-enlistment in January of 1951. In Korea, during a rest period in Japan, meeting a woman named Shoko and marrying her after knowing her less than a month. Deployment to Malaya while she remained in Japan. Selection for the elite Special Air Service. In July of 1962, deployment to Vietnam for the first time as one of the original 30 advisors. Return in July of 1963. Second deployment in July of 1964. At Ta Co in September of 1964. Severe wounds and the Distinguished Conduct Medal. Return to Australia, posting to a commando unit. And in May of 1966, a request for discharge. In May of 1967, 13 months later, paying his own way to Saigon to re-enlist for a third Vietnam tour. The pattern was not heroic in the way the citations described. It was stranger. A man abandoned at 5 who found the only structure that held him and discovered that staying in that structure meant he could reach the one person who mattered outside it. The Army was the mechanism. Shoko was the reason. The extension leave mathematics meant that the more he deployed to Vietnam, the more often he could see her. If he had taken a posting in Australia, assignment to a unit, given duties, and seen Shoko perhaps once a year if he could arrange leave and afford the travel. Staying in Vietnam as an advisor earned extension leave every few months and flights to Tokyo for 30 days at a time. The logic was precise. The logic was unconventional. The logic worked until cancer stopped it. Rayene Stewart Simpson was born in Redfern on the 16th of February, 1926, to parents who could not keep him. Death in Tokyo on the 18th of October, 1978, and burial in a war cemetery in Yokohama. Between those dates, fighting in 4 wars, earning the Victoria Cross, the Distinguished Conduct Medal, and decorations from 3 nations, and serving longer with the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam than any other soldier. Queen Elizabeth II pinned the Victoria Cross to his chest on the 1st of May, 1970. Discharge 3 days later. 8 years after that, death of cancer in a foreign country, and the news reached Australia without much notice. The arithmetic does not resolve. The longest-serving member of one of the most highly decorated units in Australian Army history, holder of the highest award for valor his country could bestow, died in obscurity and remains largely unknown outside military historians and veteran associations. That is not an accident of history. That is a choice about what gets remembered and what does not. If this story belongs somewhere beyond the Hall of Valor at the Australian War Memorial and the memorial in the foyer of Carlingford Public School, tell someone who has not heard it. The orphan who found family in an army that sent him to 4 wars. The husband who kept deploying so he could see his wife. The warrant officer who crawled to within 10 meters of the enemy and stayed between the bullets and his men until they were safe. The Victoria Cross recipient who died unknown in Tokyo 8 years after the Queen handed him the medal. Standing behind that machine gun at Cowra when he was 18, knowing the men before him had died there hours earlier. standing in front of his company in Kontum province when he was 43, knowing the fire was aimed at him and staying there anyway. The rope around his leg. That is where it started.